All right. Good seeing everyone. Sort of like seeing everyone here. So we're basically sort of like a year further compared to sort of like last year. We're standing here sort of like in Brussels when the CRA had sort of like kicked off in earnest and this work has kicked in earnest. And I think basically sort of like there's sort of like been a lot of progress. So like both on the very practical side, sort of like the bulk of open source is now engaged, pretty much sort of like the bulk of all the open source foundations, which sort of like make up like 80–90% of whatever your number is, sort of like of the software in Europe, are now sort of like aware of the CRA, are part of the various efforts, are part of the Open Regulatory Working Group, or sort of like in some sort of like other way, sort of like well involved. We're also seeing a lot of things where we're also seeing simple things like clarification that open source stewards are not eligible for the fines. We're getting sort of like the first of the guidance. There's basically an FAQ from the Commission coming out sort of like probably in November. And when we look at these and we look at the drafts, generally sort of like things get better, things get clearer. It turns out that a lot of the worst cases we're worried about are actually not the worst case. So like the Commission sort of like tends to sort of like err towards, basically really focusing on the commercial entity that places something on the market, and really sort of like that open source steward exemption is really sort of like becoming true. And it's also becoming clear that quite a few of our activities, we actually even don't need to be an open source steward there, because essentially we're sort of like outside the scope, or some of our activities are simply outside the scope of the CRA completely. And we're sort of like also like basically seeing sort of like now delegated acts appearing on things like the vulnerability process, which sort of like bring clarity there. There's still quite a few areas which aren't going as well, like the standards are still a major problem. There's still the hope that a lot of these things can be done by sort of like, presumptive conformity, sort of like through the standards. But we're seeing sort of like the horizontal standards that, the quality is sort of like concerning. And that if we look at some of the work sort of like done around the S-bombs and identifier, that's basically, that's not going well. And essentially, we almost sort of like are getting to a situation where a part of the industry doesn't seem to realize that we've been doing things like package managers and dependency things and version numbers for, I don't know, 20 years or something like that. But anyway, sort of like that's sort of like, by and large, sort of like things have progressed a lot. And I think sort of like that sort of like means that we can sort of like now actually, I think, change a little bit sort of like how we look at things and what we're working on. And I think sort of like now, so like this year, we can sort of like for the first time talk in earnest about basically what it means for the industry, what it means for us, and actually sort of like have real data there. And sort of like what I want to focus sort of like now on is not so much what it means for the SMEs and all the people who basically, our own industry, which needs to be helped, because I think the previous speaker spoke about that, and there's a whole bunch of separate efforts for SMEs and so on to help there. But I basically want to focus on what it means for us as open source stewards, because we're getting sort of like all this clarity. And I think the first thing to emphasize there is that the concept of an open source steward in the CRA is not the equivalent of a foundation. You're an open source steward on a specific product, and you can actually be something entirely different on another product in your foundation, on another sort of like release. So these are fairly like, sort of like legal concepts. And luckily, sort of like we're getting the guidance and the FAQ and these sort of like things to help us there. It's also becoming, I think, very, very clear now that in the definition of that open source steward, some of the very, very important parts are the fact that you can only be an open source steward if you're providing support on a sustained basis for the development of a digital product, and it has to be intended for commercial activities. So your work at that foundation has to be intended for commercial activity. You're expecting it to be used sort of like that way. And what we sort of like see in a lot of the way a lot of things sort of like are now being refined and clarified is that most of the focus is really sort of like downstream from us. And what's left for us to do is actually a fairly limited set of things, like having some policies, which we often already have, having something almost as simple as a security.txt file in the right places, or at least that's sort of like how we've done it. We've sort of like never properly standardized that. And given the fact that the horizontal standards are basically quite simple and low quality, these are really not a concern, because virtually every open source foundation is already doing way better and being way more advanced than those standards required. And the mandatory things such as like incident reporting and so on they do not seem to sort of like be that hard. And every time sort of like there is a point where you go like, oh, this may be a bit problematic, things generally sort of like fall on the positive side. So for example, like for some of the vulnerability reporting, what we're now hearing, yes, we're actually having the system properly ready on time. Yes, it will support an API absolutely from day one, which is important because, I mean, just imagine the pain of having to enroll thousands of developers and complex two-factor authentication, which even may be tied to European systems, basically on day one, and already sort of like having the institution saying like, oh, we can't handle sort of like these numbers. I mean, that's already far too high. I mean, how do you mean you have 300 projects? No, we just, yeah, no, that's that. So I think sort of like what we're seeing there is actually, yes, there will be APIs, and we sort of like, it's very likely that we can sort of like get these things off the ground very easily. So with that said, I'd like to sort of like take a little step back and go back sort of like, why are we even here? Why are open source stewards even in the CRA as a special group? Why did open source sort of like win essentially the market? Why is like 90% of what you have on your phone or on your computer or whatever, why is that based on open source? And essentially, sort of like at the core of that open source is, I think, something which we sort of like can use now and also sort of like need to focus on for next year. Is the reason open source so often wins is that essentially it's a group of people who have sort of like a common goal. They're not competing around that goal. They need something to run their business, to sell shoes, to do newspapers, whatever it is, run cars, and rather than compete with others around the stuff they all have to do exactly the same way, they sort of like collaborate, and they don't vote with money so much, they vote with resources. They vote with their own time to sort of like build that thing collectively they all need. So there is a feedback mechanism which makes sure that whatever that piece of open source is, it is sort of like the thing everyone agrees on how to do, and everyone sort of like is not competing around, everyone uses, and you sort of like get directly from the call phase, from the people using it, you're sort of like getting direct feedback on how it's being used. And that often means that a piece of open source in its little niches becomes essentially the best way of doing it very, very rapidly, because it sort of like gets this information from the market, and there's a very sort of like active feedback loop. People are voting with their feet, companies are voting with their feet what they let their engineers work on that open source. So it's important to realize here that this is actually this is proven to be a more powerful system than pumping money into someone else and asking someone else to do something for you. So most open source foundations are not things you throw money in and then they develop something for you. No, instead, basically, they're essentially developers who work sort of like themselves on the code they need on that day for their companies, for their employers, for themselves, whatever it is, and sort of like get you the best thing. And sort of like any concerns about like freeloaders and all sorts of other things are generally sort of like an orthogonal issue, not really an issue, because you already are getting the win-win out of it anyway. So who should pay for it isn't really sort of like the core of that whole problem. And the reason why I'm mentioning is that it's important to remember that in a lot of other industries where we have similar systems, very often the payment systems around those, the collection systems around those, like think, for example, of music payments or score payments or theatrical payments or payments for artists that do dubbing of James Bond or something like that. Very often the payment systems sort of like take 90% of the money and only 10% of the money goes to the artists or the packaging industry or the recycling industry or whatever else. Most of the money sort of like sticks in that system. And I'll get back to that a little bit, why I mentioned that. So if we sort of like take the reason why open source sort of like has that win, why open source sort of like became dominant and still is dominant and often sort of like becomes dominant in a new area as soon as people start to collaborate, it's basically because essentially people are working together on their actual problems, the problems they have themselves. They're not paid to work on the problem of someone else. They're sort of like not money flowing, and it's basically you're working on that. So basically what we sort of like are now, I think now in a position with all the clarity we have on the CRA is to actually sort of like start working again together on the problems we have as an industry. So on the things we're not competing against each other with. So if we look at that like okay, so what do we have to do as stewards ourselves? Well, actually that's extremely limited. It's a very basic policy. It's a bit of vulnerability reporting, A couple of other things, and we're basically already doing all of those things pretty much already. So that's done. I mean, there are lots of details, but it's done essentially. And give it another year and a bit of work, and we'll have that squared away. The next problem is that we as open source are the industry. Everyone, like in the Apache Software Foundation, which I hail from, everyone there works at companies who are under the full brunt of the CRA. They actually have to do the real work, do the risk assessments, and so on and so on and so on. Get the attestations and what else. So basically, if I look at that, in most cases, you're not going to compete with a competitor on having better release notes, having better SBOMs, having better risk assessments of your Kafka, having better risk assessment of your Tomcat or your XML parser. Oh no, of course not. They're exactly the same sort of like beast. So what I'm sort of like expecting and hoping is that sort of like in the next year, we'll basically sort of like can start working on doing a lot of basically figuring out how we basically do these things at the Open Source Foundation collectively again. So just sort of like 20 years ago, we had to invent a common vulnerability, the whole common vulnerability systems and full disclosure and all these sort of other things and release notes and whatever else. So like now, essentially, what we now need to find out, okay, so what, where and when can we as an open source community of the people who actually use that software, who develop it, where can we actually sort of like write enough of the risk assessments to help everyone, to help ourselves, like when we're actually sort of like using it as SMEs, like in our SME roles. Where can we sort of like do enough sort of like of the SBOMs, have a lot of the release notes, and also have enough of the security by design and other policies, which essentially you as a downstream user of that software package can sort of like cut and paste and merge into your sort of like the documentation, which you have to do. Because we as open source stewards don't have to do it, but downstream of us it has to be done. So basically, which of those bits we can do sort of like collectively. So I'm expecting that sort of like from this workshop onwards, we'll now basically be focusing on creating a lot of content. And a lot of the content we actually already know and have. It's just that we've not written it down, or not written it down in that shape. I mean, we generally have good security policies. We have incident reporting policies. So basically, write those down in a way that it can be used downstream from us. And then I think the second very large area which we need to tackle is in the CRA is a special article, Article 25, where basically open source stewards are given the opportunity or given the ability or they're allowed to do an attestation of their software for their community, which is usable downstreams. So if our members, basically the companies using our software sort of like collectively want that, we as open source stewards are allowed to give them a home at the open source stewards to do that attestation collectively. So you don't have to do the attestation at every company individually separately. So just like you're writing sort of like source code together, you're sort of like now also allowed essentially to essentially write attestation together. So I think that's going to be like a large chunk sort of like of next year as well in parallel with that content, where basically we work on like, okay, so what does this attestation look like? How do we do that collectively? How do we make that reusable? And so on. And a large part of that, of course, is as simple as checklists and again, sort of like has a lot of overlap with the things you have to do anyway, but it sort of like comes with it comes with a very specific promise, just like we sort of like promise that we will never, like for example, the Apache Software Foundation releases that we'll never ship something knowingly with a bug or a vulnerability without disclosing that. So again, sort of like with attestation, we're sort of like going a step further, sort of like where we have to do them. So I think sort of like that, sort of like I guess sort of like is the change from last year to this year. Last year, lots of things were unclear. Now, actually, a lot of things are unclear. So now it's really sort of like is about like creating content. We sort of like now know what we have to do there. Start on this attestation, and by and large, what we're seeing is that open source stewards were not heavily hit. But our downstream community, the people who use our software, which basically we are ourselves, because we all work for companies which use that software, they sort of like need all the help they can get, and these are all things you're not competing on. I mean, you're not going to compete on like who's got the best attestation or something like that. It's a checkbox thing. So basically, that's sort of like I think where next year sort of like needs to go, and hopefully sort of like we'll start sort of like today with kicking off that new phase of actually creating that content and starting anew on the attestation work stream. Thank you.